Good evening and welcome to For the Record. It's been weeks now since Tropical Cyclone Winston hit parts of Fiji, but the work continues in many aspects and many sectors of the government, one of which is the mental and psychological support that communities which were directly hit by the tropical cyclone need now and into the future. There is a lot of work going on the ground by various NGOs, expert organizations, and the Ministry of Health itself. And speaking of the Ministry of Health, our guest tonight is the Acting National Advisor on Mental Health and the chairperson of the body that's looking after all the psychological aid that is needed in the affected communities. Dr. Nirvana Karan, thank you very much for being on the show. There's, as I said, a lot of work going on, a lot of organizations involved, but I understand there is coordination here and everybody is working in tandem to reach out to these communities. So if you were to give an overall picture, what's the program in getting to these communities where psychosocial help may be needed?
Well, thank you for having us on the show to begin with. And so after Cyclone Winston, certain subclusters were set up to look after the various needs that were arising. And one of the subclusters that was set up under the overall health and nutrition cluster was the psychosocial and mental health subcluster. And this subcluster is made up of lots of partners, which is, like you pointed out, they're NGOs, they're organizations who've got an interest in mental health and psychosocial support, and also ministerial departments and other agencies. And so we all came together, and so that to make sure that there's a coordinated effort going out there, that we're not duplicating work in different areas, or that we're not just going to certain areas and missing out on areas. And that's why this whole coordination was called, and this whole cluster exists to make sure we can coordinate and provide the support where it's needed in a very accessible way, and to make sure that everyone gets equal access and not get missed out or anything.
How do you decide where help is needed?
Well, and we were told that according to the Ministry of Health, we have priority areas. And these priority areas are those areas within the 50-kilometer radius of the eye of the cyclone. So the part that the cyclone took, in the 50-kilometer radius, whichever area fell under that became a priority area. But that's not to say that all the help and support went to the priority areas only. We're targeting all the areas that could have been affected in any way.
Later on in the show, we'll talk about what some of the feedback has been and what some of the stories we are coming to hear and the impact that people have suffered. But as of now, my understanding is that before Tropical Cyclone Winston, there really wasn't any sort of program or documentation, or nothing really existed to help you and organizations like, say, Empower Pacific and them to go out into communities and to have a structure to follow. Is this something that your committee had to come up with? How did it happen?
Yes, so I think this was it has to be said, this was one of the biggest disasters that Fiji has gone through. And so since the cyclone hit, we had to organize and we had to think about a very structured and think of all the interventions that could have been done. So we got together as a cluster group and looked at the various ways that psychosocial and mental health support could have been provided. And the whole group, I think, agreed, and we looked at all the evidence that psychological first aid would be one of the best evidence-based approach that could be used to provide the support. And so that's how it started off. And I think following this disaster, there's a lot of things we've learned, and in retrospect, we can now say we'd be better prepared for the next one.
Is it something that we should have been prepared for previously, or something that, over time we may have lost sight of?
I think there was lots of work that was done to prepare for it. I think a couple of years ago, we had trained quite a few people on psychological first aid. But then people move around, people change locations and things. But this sort of work had been going on, but following this disaster, we're really more focused on getting this done and having a plan for the future.
Let's look at some of the figures. this has been provided by the Ministry of Health. There's something like 22,000 people who've been assisted in one way or another. So when we talk about these 22,000, is it that these 22,000 have been traumatized or severely mentally impacted by TC Winston, or what's the degree of help that's been given?
So I think we have to put it out there that not everyone that's affected by the cyclone needs any sort of one-to-one intervention. And you can't force this sort of support on people. If someone is not ready to talk, then that's well and fine. But we also have to provide a forum where if people want to share and talk and are traumatized, they have a place to go and talk and get the help they need. So the psychological first aid is just the first response. And it's to provide support, it's to listen to people, it's to link people to other services that should they need, and things like that. And if we're seeing people that are needing further support or more immediate support than this basic support that we're providing, then there's a referral pathway to follow. And most of the agencies that are working with us are aware of this referral pathway. But I think we have to be aware that there are certain stages of reactions that happen after a disaster or a very traumatic event. And these stages are what we're seeing. So like in the beginning, after the disaster occurs, there's shock and there's, people can't believe that this has happened to them. And we saw that in the field. People were shocked, they were upset, they were fearful about what's going to happen in the future and things like that. And this happens immediately after the disaster. And then following...
It's a natural reaction.
And it's a natural reaction.
Okay. Right.
I mean, if you went through a traumatic event, you would be upset, you would be scared, you would be worried about your future and everything. And so after that comes what we call the honeymoon phase. And this is in the 1 to 2 weeks following the disaster, where people want to talk about things. They want to share what they went through, or we've got stories of people telling us where they were when the disaster happened, what they did, and things like that. So there's sharing of common experiences. There's this solidarity among people. People want to rebuild, and you want to get on with things. And then following the honeymoon phase comes
how long does the honeymoon phase last?
So it can go from 2 weeks to 2 months to 6 months.
Maybe a lot of these people are still in the honeymoon phase,
Yes.
so to speak. Okay,
Yes.
let's take a quick break and then we'll pick it up in a few minutes. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Pulavunaka, and welcome back to the show. We're speaking with Dr. Nirvana Karan, the Acting National Advisor for Mental Health. Dr. Karan, before the break, you were talking about how there's a natural process of reaction from people after Tropical Cyclone Winston. The honeymoon phase, as you described, I take it that's a term used,
Yes.
a jargon used in the industry.
Yes. So following any traumatic event, or not only disaster, where there is any traumatic event that's happening, a tsunami or earthquake or anything, following that, people go through natural reaction. And I think it's important for people to know what those normal reactions are, so that we don't just pathologize everything that people are going through. So in the beginning, like I was saying, people are in shock after a disaster of this proportion, and they're fearful about what's going to happen and all of those. And then after that, we come into the honeymoon phase, where everyone is wanting to work together, they want to share their experiences, and there's hope for the future and things like that. And these phases can last a while. So this second phase can go from 2 weeks to 3 months, or up to 6 months in some areas that we looked at. And following the honeymoon phase, then the disillusionment phase sets in. So this is when people are starting to realize their losses, and they feel frustrated and angry about what has happened to them, or how much they've lost, and what they had to go through. And following the disillusionment phase comes the reconstruction phase. And this reconstruction phase can go up to from 2 years to a lifetime, because people have lost so much. So it takes a while to rebuild. In the reconstruction phase, people start accepting the losses, whatever they've lost. For example, if they lost their house or they lost their farms and crops and things like that. So they begin to accept the losses and they rebuild. And what is seen worldwide is when people start rebuilding, they rebuild better than they were before. So it's not saying that this is something good that's happened to us, but the good thing that comes out of it is that majority of the people will rebuild better.
And so, I mean, if we were to take this, what you've described, onto the ground, there would be families and friends going into the community to visit relatives. And how do they know, how do they pick out some of these signs? Or is that something that only expert help can pick out, like a doctor or one of these NGOs who go out into the community?
Well, I think psychosocial support and mental health support is not something that only a doctor can do or a health professional. Anyone can do that. I mean, if you're just listening to someone and supporting someone, that's providing psychosocial support in itself, just listening. And so psychological first aid is not something that's done by professionals only. It can be done by all first responders who are trained in this. And so if you look at the list, there's lots of organizations who are going out and doing this. And these are not health professionals, but in their own capacity, they've been trained in psychological first aid and they know how to support. But if people are going out to villages, say for example, you're going out to visit your family in other areas that may have been affected by this cyclone, just simply listening and offering to help them with whatever you can is providing that support anyways.
There's talk, I mean, people say, the cyclone was so devastating and it's traumatized so many people. You sort of get this impression that those who are not affected or were not affected expect a large group of our society to be permanently or severely traumatized in the long term and to have very deep, very lasting effects from what they went through. Is that a fair observation? I mean, how does one make such an observation?
Well, I think if we look at parts of the world where they've gone through disasters of this proportion, like I said, majority of the people will come out resilient and stronger. But of course, they have been through a traumatic event and they will talk about it for years to come if they want to. Some people won't talk about it, but it's just everyone's different and they'll react differently. What will be seen later on is if there are people who are not coping well or struggling, this is the ones that will need that extra help. But at the moment, for most of the part when we're going out in the field, we're seeing a lot of resilience, that people are rebuilding, they want to get back on with their lives and things like that. And so far, one of the things we're collecting in the data is how many people needed to be referred for like that one-to-one interventions or had to be referred on to specialist services for help. And so far, we've only got a number of 7, and which is in line with what we had expected, that majority will show good resilience and coping skills.
So going into the future with the work that your cluster is doing, what exactly can we expect in the coming months and maybe by the end of the year?
So what we did is initially we were going out to provide everyone was going out to provide that support, and now we're moving on through the phases and moving on, the disaster month has finished as well. But the activities will continue, and the cluster is looking at all those activities. And one of the things that we have done in the past years is that we've trained a lot of health professionals in mental health interventions or how to respond to specialist help that will be required. And so over the year, we are going to continue to train health staff and to make sure that we have every area at least has a staff or health professional that is trained in mental health intervention guidelines, and then they know how to respond in the first place and how to refer on to other services as needed. So that will go on, and the psychological first aid is still going on. And we were thinking, like, how do we do this psychological first aid? How do you go out and do this? So we thought that the best way to do this would be to do it in the form of a talanoa. Everyone likes talking. It's an informal conversation. And people can just share their experiences and things. So this is what the groups are going out. They're offering to listen. They're offering to talk. They're offering to link people up with services that that they think they need, and things like that. So this is what's happening.
Okay, and with that, we've come to the end of another segment. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Good evening and welcome back to For the Record. Our guest tonight, the Acting National Advisor on Mental Health, Dr. Nirvana Karan. Dr. Karan, you're talking about how psychological first aid is being turned into a Talanoa session. How exactly do you get people to open up? Are they readily wanting to talk about their experience, or do you actually have to use some sort of technique?
No, actually. So what we're doing is when teams are going out there, we're offering to talk. And I think the important thing to remember is not to force anyone to talk. If someone does not want to talk and they're not ready to, that's well and fine as well, because people react differently, and they will, some people may not want to talk now, they might want to talk later on in the coming months. Some people may never want to talk about it, but for the majority of the part, we're seeing that people are wanting to talk about their experiences. So when we're going out, we're when we're going out into a community, we're offering a space to listen. And people are coming together and talking about their experiences or telling us about what they went through. And in majority of the parts, they are concerned about their basic needs. So food, shelter, security, and things like that. And so we listen and we talk, and we have a list of numbers that we get from the officers to give out so that people know which numbers to dial if they're having a water problem or if they're having ration problems or anything. There's all these numbers that have been given out by the government that people can call directly to. So those numbers are out there, and we facilitate that. And if there's anyone needing any extra help, then we'll make arrangements for those sort of things. So it's just going out there and offering to listen to someone.
So these numbers that you hand out, is it sort of like reassuring them? Is it a form of reassurance that they're looking for to know that their concerns can be addressed?
Yes, because these numbers were all set up by the government to make things easier for people, so that you're not calling 10 different numbers or getting passed around and no one's listening to you. So all these numbers are there to help out. Like agencies like Red Cross set up a number whereby you could call following the disaster, and if you wanted to locate your relative and you couldn't, they would help you do that. So there was things like that different organizations set up, and there is 24-hour toll-free lines for counseling through Lifeline, Empower Pacific. So all these numbers are out there. There's also numbers about who to call if you're having water problems or electricity problems and things like that. And I think it's important. Maybe it's not important, we have access to telephone, radio, TV, everything. But there are areas which don't, and it's important to give them this number so that it's easier for them to call out and get the help they need. And part of providing support is linking people up with all of these things, so that they don't feel like they're just left on their own wherever they are in the remote areas.
I suppose, I don't know, but it could be frustrating for somebody in that situation to not have these basic needs and then not know who to turn to.
Exactly. And when you're providing these numbers, then at least you're supporting them with that. And that's helping and supporting, and that's psychological first aid as well. So it's linking, it's looking out for things, and it's listening.
A lot of people who may not know would assume when we talk about psychological first aid that you go into a community, you sit them down in a room, and you have a lecture. How does it actually work?
Well, one of the ways to provide for support is to give out information and do awareness. And so people are going out there and they're talking about these things, and people are coming in and they're listening, and then they're opening up. They're telling their own stories, then they're talking, and we're also asking them about their basic needs. Do they have anything that they would want to talk about or want us to take back and link them up with? So these are the things that are coming up in these sessions. And then we've also set time aside for people who want to have a one-to-one discussion, because not everyone is comfortable in a group. So we've got that time as well. So that's how we're facilitating it. We're going out in the first instance to provide information and then taking it from there.
But you can't make people talk. You can't
No.
force them to go into a session.
No. So there was a lot of questions about that we got from various groups that said, well, when you go out there, why aren't you telling everyone to talk? But we looked at all the evidence and everything, and you don't force people to talk. If they don't want to talk, you don't force them to talk, because there's evidence that you're going to just re-traumatize someone who's not wanting to talk about it.
So, I mean, if say, for example, there are private donors or relatives and friends who are going to visit these affected people, and it's human nature to ask.
Yeah. Well, we're saying, ask, how are you doing? Not where were you at the time of the cyclone? What were you doing when the roof flew off? What did you do? Where was this and things? It's how are you doing at the moment? And if they want to talk, then listening, but not forcing them to tell you all the little details if someone is not wanting to.
Don't make them relive the trauma?
No, definitely not. You don't want them to relive it. You're there to listen if they want to talk about it, and you're there to support them through it, but you're not there to force people, no.
And so let's go back to the work that your cluster is doing. There are some figures about psychosocial support in communities, in schools, and it's even broken down right down to the district and Tikina levels. How do you expect this information will be useful in the future?
Well, we thought because it's a big area, and we wanted to collect information on what is being done, so that there are areas that are not missed out. So when we're collecting this data, at least all the agencies that are working together can see that, okay, this area has been covered, but this area has not been covered. So the purpose was not to miss out any areas, to make sure that everyone has equal access, also to prevent duplication, because we didn't want 4 or 5 agencies to go to the same area and do the same thing over and over again, and this other area, nothing has happened. So it was to coordinate all of that. And of course, when we have this data, when we can look back, we can plan for things and plan for activities throughout the year. So whichever areas have not been covered, how we're going to provide support in those areas, and things like that. So it's very useful to us to see what has been done and plan for what can be done.
Okay, and with that, we will take another quick break. Stay with us, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the psychosocial aid that is being provided in parts of Fiji following Tropical Cyclone Winston. And our guest is the Acting National Advisor on Mental Health, Dr. Nirvana Karan. Dr. Karan, we were talking about how there are so many communities that have been visited, and there are numbers, some 22,000 people who've been covered by the various agencies. Yeah. Do you feel that there would be a need to revisit some of these areas? Is there some sort of follow-up plan? Or does it work in a way that they go into a community and they talk to people, and if they feel sufficiently satisfied that they've done enough, they move out? Well,
so when we're going in and we're finding that there's individuals that need follow-up or communities that need a follow-up visit, we're noting that down, and the agency is going back to do a follow-up visit. So that is being done, and if there's anyone during the follow-up visit or during the initial visit that's needing any immediate support, then they're being referred on to the appropriate services as well.
When your teams have gone into these communities, you mentioned that some of the families are worried about their future. So what are some of the things? I understand there is the issue of confidentiality and protecting the patient's wishes, but what are some of the general issues which are coming forward?
So from the field reports and being out in the field and myself, the initial the most worrying concern for a lot of people, their basic needs and how they're going to rebuild for the future. So there's a few communities that said, yeah, we received all the support and now, but they're all moving into the future. How am I going to get my livelihood back? Because farms were lost and things like that. So how am I going to get back into it? And everyone is slowly focusing more into their livelihoods. So it's the basic needs, making sure that their farms are running or trying to clear up areas so that they can start. But a lot of them were thinking about the future. There was some frustration in certain areas when their basic needs were not met. And so we took this back and we linked them with the appropriate services as well. So there's things like that. There's lots of reactions out there.
From what you're saying, it's not something that people will get over just by talking about it. There needs to be action on it. And does that mean that the very people in the communities need to be active to get over some of their fears about their future and their basic needs, or is that something that the government needs to take charge of?
Well, definitely, I think it's going to be a joint effort. It has to be from the communities and it has to be from us as well. So it's going to be a joint effort, and a lot of people we're encouraging people to go back to their routines, to get back to their daily livelihoods, and if there's support needed, we're encouraging them to reach out and ask for that support so that we know that this area needs the support in terms of whatever needs that they're struggling with. And so it's not just, you're right, it's not just going and talking and listening, but people's basic needs have to be addressed as well so that they feel secure and comfortable enough. I think if you look at it, if you have enough to eat, you have a roof over your head and you're secure, that's only then your mental health will be stable, right?
Are they in a state, or is it so bad on the ground from the field reports that people feel powerless to change their future, or is it something that's just in the back of their minds?
I think for the majority, there's a lot of resilience, and we're seeing lots of resilience and good coping. And there's a few that are not coping well, but majority are wanting to rebuild, and majority do want to focus on the future. So, which is a really good thing for us. But of course, things are not going to be the same as they were before the cyclone hit us. And but hopefully we will be rebuilding in a better way. And
do you feel that these communities know or are aware that this is going to be a long-term process, and the issues that they may be going through on a psychological state will take time to heal for the severe cases which aren't showing resilience?
Well, the main thing we've told everyone going out is not to make any false promises. As if there was something that we're not able to do, we're telling the responders to tell the communities, yes, this is not within our reach, but if you do, this is the agency that can help you out. So we're doing that linking, which is really important. But we're also preparing ourselves as a service to cater for the needs that may arise later on in the coming months when people get into the disillusionment or the other phases, or if people are so severely traumatized and they're needing specialist help. If they're not sleeping well, or they're not coping at school or at the work and things like that. When those things start coming up, we're also preparing ourselves to be able to handle those kind of issues if they come up.
It's commonly said that in Fiji people don't talk about their mental and their psychological issues. But looking at the numbers, there's 22,000 people that have been covered since the cyclone, and there's some of the figures are showing there are more men who are willing to speak, who are coming forward, than there are women. So, how has this been for your cluster and for mental health in Fiji in terms of discovering people's willingness to share?
I think for majority of the part, we have found that people are wanting to share, they're wanting to talk about about things, and they're wanting to get help and support. And like you said, the data that has been coming in is quite surprising to us as well, that there's so many people out there that are wanting to talk about these things. And of course, we're not forcing anyone to talk. These are people who are coming up and wanting to share and take part and get support, get information, get back on their lives and things.
Some of these people would want to talk, but they don't want to do it in a community setting. They don't want their neighbors to know that I'm talking to someone. So how do you facilitate that? I mean, are there places where they can go, because their lives are pretty much in tatters? They don't have a house. They probably don't have an income either.
Yeah. So when we're going out there, because we're having a more family-based approach, so children, male, female, whoever's part of the family or the community can come and talk. But obviously, like you said, not everyone's going to want to talk in groups. We're also telling all responders to keep some time aside for people who want to talk one-to-one. But if you're not wanting to talk over there and you're wanting to talk later, then there are numbers, toll-free numbers, that are operational 24 hours that people can call. And it's in the brochures and lots of the information that has gone out. They can call these toll-free numbers and they can get that one-to-one support that they need.
When you go into, are your groups, first of all, going into schools, and what's the resilience of students, these young people? I mean, you know, we talk about kids. It's harder for kids to cope, so to speak.
It's hard for everyone, I think, and for the school children, the Ministry of Education had their own group of counsellors which went out in the schools. But UNICEF has come up with this the school-based activity. There's children's activity books that they have prepared and localized to Fiji, which is, from my understanding, is going through pre-test in the field over the last 2 weeks, and then will be implemented in the schools, in all schools, for children to do as an activity and to share the experiences and go through it. And there's a guide that comes along with it, which will tell teachers how to facilitate this session to take care of the needs of these children. And I'm also aware that the Ministry of Education also looked at all the students who had to be relocated and provided counselling services and support to them as well.
Okay, and on that note, we've come to the end of another segment. We'll take another break. Good evening and welcome back to For the Record. We're talking about the mental impact of Tropical Cyclone Winston and what sort of psychosocial aid is being provided in various parts of the community. Our guest is Dr. Nirvana Karan, the Acting National Advisor on Mental Health. Dr. Karan, we've spoken a lot about what sort of help is being provided in the community, in schools and whatnot. But what are some of the signs that we should be looking out for, or some of the reactions that we should be seeing in the communities?
Well, I think everyone reacts differently. So you'll have your adults and you have children who react differently as well. And some of the things, there's natural reactions to grief and loss. And naturally people are going to be upset because some of them lost their whole homes and their livelihood and things. So they're going to be upset, they're going to be sad, they're going to cry, and they're going to talk about these things. So all these things will happen, and there will be people who will be anxious and worried about their future. And of course it's natural to be worried, because if you lost your home, you're going to be worried about it. I mean, it's your whole life's effort there. So there's these things that will happen, and in the kids you'll notice that the kids are more clingy to their mums, their little ones, and they don't want to be separated from the adults, or they're following the adults around. You might find that they're not sleeping well or having nightmares. And one of the other interesting things that can happen is you'll see kids enacting the cyclone in their play when they're playing outside and things like that. So these are all reactions that will come out, which are normal. But then having said that, I think we also have to be aware that if any of these signs are persisting over time, then we do come forward and ask for help, or get some help from specialist services.
How much time? I mean, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months?
Okay, so initially after any traumatic event, in the first 4 to 6 weeks, we do not diagnose anyone with a new mental disorder or anything like that, because you have to allow time for natural reactions and processes to go through. So having passed that 6-week period, sort of, then we're telling people that if you're noticing, if you're having difficulties with your sleep, if you're not eating well, you're feeling more upset than usual, you can't concentrate in school or you can't concentrate at your work and things like that. And if it's persisting, please come forward and ask for help. And there are support and services out there that can help you with all those things.
And what about change in mannerisms, or somebody's personality is slightly different from what they used to be? Is that also, could that also be a reaction?
Well, different people will cope differently, and there's no right or wrong reaction. There will be lots of reactions. But if there's someone who's totally changed from what they were before, and their family members or friends are really concerned, then that's something that needs to be brought forward, and help needs to be sought for those kind of issues.
And what if someone is not showing any emotion at all? You know, somebody who's just who pretends as if nothing happened, so to speak.
Well, we had this question come up to us quite a bit. So on one hand, we have people who are grieving and going through these reactions, but then people were asking, well, there are people who are pretending like nothing happened, and they're going on with their usual lives and everything. So there's someone who came up to, there's quite a few people coming in saying, well, I think this person is really troubled because they're not talking about it. I think everyone is on their own time. If they don't want to talk about it and they're coping by going back to their daily routines, that's fine as well. That's how this person is coping. Crying is one way of coping. The other person might want to just get back to their life and start doing everything, and that's coping as well. There's no right or wrong way to cope in these two situations. Mm-hmm. But of course, if there's someone, if you're noticing any safety issues or things like that that are concerning you, then by all means, ask for advice from the professionals.
Dr. Karen, thank you very much for your time. That's the end of our show this evening. Okay. Thank you very much, and best of luck in the future.
Thanks for having us, Edwin.
Thanks. And that was our show for this evening. Remember, if you have any comments or questions, you can email us for the record at fbc.com.fj. I'll be back again next Sunday, but until then, good night from me. Up next, however, is the My Say segment with Nimani Ndelaibatiki. From me, good night.
Good evening. I'm Nemani Ndelaibatiki of the Fiji Sun. Welcome to Fiji's only TV editorial show. Tonight, I'm going to speak about the debate over the new bid to reinstate the Great Council of Chiefs. At a time when we should be discussing how we can improve our rebuilding efforts after Cyclone Winston, the opposition saw it fit to bring a petition to Parliament about the reinstatement of the Great Council of Chiefs as the most urgent and pressing matter. Is this for real? What do you think are the most important issues in the minds of our people, particularly those in disaster-affected areas right now? Food, shelter, continuing education for the children, rebuilding and rehabilitation, jobs, security, health, business, investment, the economy, etc. Disasters strike us across the board, irrespective of our socio-economic status. We all get affected one way or another. You throw in the reinstatement of the Great Council of Chiefs into the mix, and they don't gel, because it does not provide an essential ingredient to effect the kind of change the country needs right now. Since the Great Council of Chiefs was abolished in 2012, we as a nation have progressed. There is more equal distribution of national wealth through infrastructure development and various government assistance and subsidy, like free education, free school bus fare, free milk and Weet-Bix for Class 1 students, cheaper electricity, water, medicine, and bus fare for the poor, destitute, physically disabled, and the elderly. The list goes on. Those in the corridors of power are insensitive if they think the GCC is the most important thing to talk about right now. Think of our brothers and sisters who are out there desperately waiting for a system to help them survive and live a decent standard of life that others enjoy. The GCC was an institution set up by our British colonial rulers to keep the Tauke, the indigenous people, under control and prevent dissent. They used the chiefs to use their influence to keep the ordinary Tauke away from challenging the establishment. When Fiji became independent in 1970, it brought about positive change. Democracy and freedom of choice became the buzzwords. But this freedom fundamentally challenged the concept and foundation on which the GCC was built. The British created the GCC as a political tool to become the repository, guardian, and symbol of all things Tauke. The only problem was that it was autocratic and therefore undemocratic. Some would argue that GCC delegates were free to express themselves and vote on issues based on democratic principles. The process was merely academic. At the end of those meetings, politicians usually had the final say. The GCC was not independent in that sense. When Ratu Sir Mara's Alliance Party was in power, most of his cabinet sat in the GCC. The GCC became another mouthpiece of the alliance government, the elite and their hangers-on. It became entrenched in the system under the then constitution. The GCC elected the president and vice president for a 5-year term and nominated 14 senators. After more than 40 years in power, the alliance government was defeated in 1987 by the powerful Fiji Labour Party National Federation Party coalition of Dr. Timothy Bhavandra. Under nationalist Tauke movement supporters took to the streets with the passive support of some members of the GCC to protest against the Indo-Fijian dominated government. They backed the military coup led by Sitiveni Rabuka in a bid to restore Tauke political supremacy. The alliance defeat was also a rejection of the GCC because it lost a significant number of traditional Tauke support to the new coalition government. These were Tauke who were fed up of political rhetorics and false promises from the alliance government. The other time this had happened was in 1977 when Fiji Nationalist Party leader Sakeasi Butanroka snatched away enough Tauke votes from the alliance government to lose to the NFP, which could not form the government because of internal bickering. The alliance government bounced back to power in the fresh election the same year. These were early signs that the GCC really had no power to control the Tauke. Again in 2000, the GCC was powerless to stop the rampaging mob of mainly Tauke who rioted and looted shops in the Suva streets. On this score, the GCC had become irrelevant, and we cannot really justify its reinstatement. The opposition had argued that the GCC had a stabilizing influence. If it did, there was no overwhelming evidence to prove it in the political upheavals that changed the course of history for our nation. It remained as what our British colonialists had envisioned it would become. Even on that score, it became a failure because it could not contain Tauke discontent. Those who are pushing for GCC restoration still live in a time warp and need to wake up to the realities facing our nation. The relationship between chiefs and ordinary Tauke is as strong as ever, even without the GCC, and the Tauke culture and traditions are still intact. Let's forget about the GCC and talk about issues that will move us forward. I'm Nemani Ndelembatiki. That was my say tonight. For more of my views, you can read the Fiji Sun. See you next week.